A very good afternoon to both my panelists present for today's talk, Dr. Geeti Das and Dr. Nitya Rao. Today's would be Politica's second virtual panel discussion, which would be a direct follow-up to our last week's talk on the apathy of the state towards the migrants. This is part of our Shram Ko Naman initiative, which is a collective effort of the Center for New Economic Studies to interpret and understand the impact of the current crisis on India's working class. The impact of this unprecedented lockdown can be seen across all industries and organizations, including workers across different socioeconomic stratas. This would not only include the migrant laborers, but also the self-employed and the casual workers throughout India. Now, Politica is a student-led discussion forum, which is initiated by the center, which aims to promote an interdisciplinary view towards contemporary events by engaging experts in deliberation. So these experts come from various genres of social sciences, ranging from law, political science, and economics to literature, psychology, and history. And by the medium of these discussions, we hope that our viewers get a multidimensional view towards what is happening around them and engage themselves in a well-nuanced discourse. The topic of discussion for today's event would be assessing the gendered impact of the crisis. And it gives me immense pleasure to invite the panelists for today. Our first panelist for the day would be Professor Nithya Rao, who is a senior lecturer at the University of East Anglia, with close to about 35 years of experience as a field-level practitioner, a trainer, researcher, and teacher. She has worked extensively in the field of gendered land relations, agriculture, food and nutrition security, migration and livelihoods, education, and intra-household relations. Her book entitled Good Women Do Not Inherit Land, Politics of Land and Gender in India was published in 2008 by Social Science Press, New Delhi, and republished in 2012. She has held various research projects in not only India, but also South Asia at large and East Africa. Our second panelist of the day would be Dr. Geeti Das, who is an assistant professor of political science at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Her work focuses on institutional change, infrastructures, the state, urban politics, and gender and sexuality under globalization. She holds a PhD in politics from the New School for Social Research and a BA in philosophy from the Bryn Mawr College. She's been a visiting assistant professor at Ashoka University and a teaching fellow at the New School. Now, before I hand over the floor to the panelists, I'd just like to briefly introduce the topic. And well, over the past couple of weeks, there's been a major exodus of migrant workers, and it has somewhat haunted each one of us as Indians. And in fact, last week's discussion, which is on the apathy of the state towards these migrant laborers, a particular strand of the discussion was how this apathy has somewhat extended to the society also. And it is the patriarchal and this casteist view that the society shares, which has somewhat sidelined these migrants. And within these migrants, you see that certain communities such as the women and the transgender community, they have been pushed to the periphery, which in the sense makes them the vulnerables within a vulnerable. And in fact, picking up on the concept of vulnerability, or rather the notion of vulnerability from a gendered perspective, amidst this current crisis of a pandemic, where there's a loss of livelihood and restricted human mobility, what, in your understanding, and Professor Nithya Rao, probably you could answer this first, what in your understanding are the key economic, social, and legal ramifications for gender groups across India and the rest of the developing world?
Okay, thank you, Sahil. I think maybe I will start with just a clarification. And that is, I'm a professor now, not a senior lecturer. You introduced me, okay. But that's a small point. It doesn't matter. I think in terms of gender, I think the first thing is I just wanted to clarify the definitionally, and in my understanding, gender is not only reflecting of women, but when we talk about gender, we are talking about relationships really. And these could be intersecting relationships which involve intersecting identities. So I think when we talk about a gender analysis or gender relations, we're really talking about relations. It could be between men and women, it could be between women and women. So therefore by class, it could be by race, by ethnicity, it could be between men and men, by age. So it's a whole complexity of relationships between people that we're talking about when we talk about gender. So I think I'm going to speak in that spirit, and not only about the impacts of women, but the impacts really on gender relations. Having said that, I think the issue about vulnerability, how do we understand vulnerability? Vulnerability is really the inability to cope with any kind of change, crisis, etc. It has been used in different ways. In the context of climate crisis and climate change, for instance, there's a lot of discussion around vulnerability. What it really means is that when are people unable to cope with any kind of crisis or change? And I think here, to me, Amartya Sen's early work from Poverty and Famines on entitlements is very useful. That where you have what he calls as an entitlement failure or a collapse of entitlements, and these more or less map on, to the categories that you have given in your question about economic, social, legal, and so on. So Amartya Sen talks about resource endowments or assets. And a lot of my work has been really around assets, particularly landed assets. And when you don't have assets, or assetlessness leads to vulnerability. So I think in this case, one of the impacts that we are seeing in terms of vulnerability is between people who have some asset and who don't have asset. So for instance, you're landed and landless in rural contexts. So there are migrants from both categories of people, and I'll come to gender in a minute. I mean, this is also a form of gender analysis. Similarly, there are Dalits and scheduled tribes, SCs and STs, or Adivasis, which have been spoken about. I work a lot with Adivasi communities, particularly in India. So from a perspective of vulnerability, I would say that, it is the Dalit and the Adivasis in general who have been very much more vulnerable from across all these dimensions than other castes. Of course, we have also horror stories from OBCs, from other groups who have been stranded, particularly in Gujarat and other states, and have really struggled and suffered. From Bihar migrants, we hear about this. But what has happened then? So so I think assetlessness is one. The second element of Sen's entitlement approach is really exchange entitlements. That how valuable is your labor? This is your human capital. How is it valued in the labor market? And here women are clearly at a disadvantage because you see that there is a wage gap. So even when they go into urban informal sector jobs, into brick-kiln jobs as family labor, then it's a family wage. Women don't get paid separately. In addition, if they go as family labor, then apart from the informalization of the work, the poor living and working conditions, but also there is the whole double burden in terms of also having to look after their children and so on. And we are seeing instances of that now, in the roads, in the media coverage and so on, carrying little young babies, pregnant women. Very heartbreaking stories, as you pointed out, Sahil. And this is that women, I think these two aspects, the assets and the exchange entitlements, are really interlinked. So at the bottom of the pile, the most vulnerable are those women who come from assetless backgrounds, the Dalits from landless labor households, who are going into the very bottom of the informal sector with no social security provisions, and also in very much stigmatized kind of roles. I should also add here that in this context, it has also been very difficult for these men, because I think now with the agrarian crisis, as we call it, or the stagnation in agriculture, actually many of the men too are migrating, because this is a very important part of their livelihood strategy. So I've worked in Jharkhand with Adivasi groups, and the men there are really, it is for survival. If you go back to the Marxist kind of framework, actually the agrarian economy is not paying them enough. And these men have to migrate in order to earn something, even to invest in their 1 acre or half an acre of land, marginal holdings that they may have at home. And the gendered impact on them has also been tremendous in terms of they were meant to come back home with incomes, some money which they can invest into the Kharif season. Now they are coming back home without any income, but also stigmatized with no dignity. So I think it's working both ways. And the third element of it, which you asked, was about legal. And I think, unfortunately, as you said, last week you talked about the apathy of the state, but I think it's also been the collapse of the legal entitlements. I'll just give one example, and that is the National Food Security Act, through which not only is the public distribution system, which I must say that to some extent of all the programs, this is the one which has reached at least 80% of the people who have the rural surveys and so on have shown that the PDS is one thing that has actually reached in terms of the public distribution system. But as part of the NFSA, there are also other entitlements which work through the life course, particularly for the most vulnerable women and children. So it is maternity entitlement, it is prenatal and postnatal care, it is additional food provisions in the prenatal postnatal period, it is for the early child weaning foods through the Anganwadi center, it is the school feeding programs, and all this has been at a standstill for the last 2 to 3 months post lockdown. So while you're getting your food, but the legal provisioning as per the NFSA has really collapsed. I mean, in some states, I think you're from Kerala, Sahil. Kerala has done the best actually in terms of women's self-help groups and so on, providing hot cooked meal to these children, even while schools have been closed. But in other states, I know that where children, the only good meal that they receive is the noon meal. And that has come to a standstill. You know, some rations have been distributed at home, but this excludes things like the fresh things, like the egg. In Odisha, in tribal areas, 4 times a week they were giving egg, both in the Anganwadi for pregnant women and to the young child and in schools. Now, all that is not being given. So some ration has been given as take-home ration, but the most nutritious elements are not there. So this is the final point that I wanted to say for vulnerability, that the effect on nutrition is going to be bad. I think the effects are going to be long lasting. We will not see it in the immediate future, but in the last 2 to 3 months, with the breakdown of health, with the breakdown of nutritional inputs, I think we're going to see worse effects, particularly on very vulnerable women, pregnant and lactating women, and the young child. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Professor Geeti Das, your views on the same.
Yes, so I thank you, Dr. Rao. I completely agree with the reframing of gender here. I would also add, so you asked about the economic, social, and legal ramifications. I come from a political science background, so I treat all of these as political questions, so forgive my bias in that case. But I wanted to point out 2 things. One is that there's a lot of work that's happening around urban climate resilience, especially, that is pointing out how natural disasters and pandemics are also naturalized. So they're treated as a matter of scientific management of a purely scientific or biological or ecological problem, but with very little sort of human systems analysis. And epidemiology is unusual because epidemiology is one of the few of these fields that has always had to bridge with the social sciences. So I do see an opportunity here in the way that vulnerabilities are understood in these kinds of frameworks, especially in dealing with COVID-19. The World Health Organization just recently has been releasing regular reports on gender, and they are making recommendations to member states. Unfortunately, how much power they have to actually shape policy is an entirely different question. I would say that with gender, there are, so for transgender communities in India, they are, I think at the last sort of evaluation, they're getting less than 1% of them are receiving any kind of government aid to which they are already entitled. Right? They are legally entitled. The entitlement is, even when the entitlement is there, trans people are routinely excluded. The same issue is coming up with sex workers. So these are social, these are about social exclusion, which is so deep and so enduring. And it also reflects kind of the composition of the state actors involved, right? Because I was thinking about gender in COVID-19 and thinking about essential services and who is actually on the street. And if it's police and it's delivery service workers and certain kinds of workers, you have these are male-dominated fields, right? State bureaucracies are male-dominated. Policy and planning are male-dominated. And so certain kinds of, there's Diane Elson wrote some work on male bias in development, right? That masculine norms make their way into policy frameworks. I think India is a great case of that. But I also think in terms of the intensification of pre-existing vulnerabilities, it's not a benign process or an inevitable process. I think it is happening, but it's also an active process. It's an active political process. So one example of this, in addition to kind of looking at crisis, I think we have to look at how crisis interacts with these more sort of continuous processes of marginalization.
Yeah.
So one example I'll give you is that the India Supreme Court passed a landmark judgment with regard to transgender rights, right?
Yeah, 2014.
Yes, so as of late 2019, various trans activists, and I would highly recommend the work of Shreya Illa, Anusuya, and Grace Banu, especially, who have been writing about this in a lot more detail and with a lot more nuance than I can present today, have been talking about how the Indian government's approach to dealing with transgender protection and institutionalizing it has actually thrown up a lot of new barriers so rather than kind of enshrining and protecting rights, instead it's been used as a way to intensify the regulation of their own gender identity and expression. It creates new bureaucratic hurdles for them to access services. And in fact, in some ways, it's also kind of it's actually intensifying a legal hierarchy between cisgender women and transgender women by, and one example of this is the way that they've codified penalties for sexual violence and assault, which is that I think the punishment for sexual violence or assault against a woman, typically understood in this framework to be a cisgender woman, is 7 years on paper.
Okay.
And for trans women, it's 2 months. I think it's 6 months to 2 years, right? So when you create frameworks like that, you're actually intensifying an existing social basis of exclusion.
Yeah.
And these then these coupled with stigmatization, discrimination, and so on, are intensifying the vulnerability. Also, the overrepresentation of trans women in particular and Dalit women in informal labor, in sex work, in the sort of lower tiers of healthcare and care and domestic care work, right, are all also kind of interacting with the vulnerability produced by COVID-19.
Okay. Ma'am, and this is following up on a professor from Ashoka University. He spoke about how a majority of the transgender community, like a majority of the non-transgender community, is working class. So the idea of social distancing over here and working from home, it serves as a very, very privileged idea. And this will essentially render a lot of people in the transgender community to become hungry and unable to sustain for themselves. Do you see that rolling out in the lieu of this pandemic right now?
Yes, but I think also I don't want to overstate the impact of the pandemic on what I see as a much more enduring condition. So I was thinking about sort of dynamics of power and privilege. And Maria Lugonis has this theory of gender where she talks about the light side and the dark side of gender systems, where she says, the gender as a colonial system that became standardized produced what she calls a light side and a dark side, where the light side refers to a kind of privileged notion of gender, right? That produces the idea of men as active, aggressive, sexually assertive, and so on, and women as kind of passive and sexually pure. But if you look at she says the dark side of gender is women and men who are excluded from this kind of normative ideal anyway, who are not seen as dimorphic, who are seen as sexually exploitable and as exploitable labor. And so this would be, in the US context, this would be talking about Black women and the historical the historical ideas of Black femininity. The same thing applies to Dalit women in India. So there's also a problem in the way that gender frameworks have been managed. And this also goes back, I think, to changes in sort of transnational organizing and institutions that deal with gender, which is that there's a heavy professionalization. And so the experts that you bring in, myself very much included, are coming from social strata that places us in that light side. And Dr. Rao, you bring this up in your book, when Good Women Do Not Inherit Land, when you point out that the women that you worked with have their perceptions of their identities as women seem much clearer than that of many urban middle class women. Right? But I think that we also are dealing with sort of policy frameworks and political frameworks that privilege this particular type of voice that comes from that light side, and that fundamentally fails to understand what's at stake for women who are already kind of left out of that type of gender relationship.
Yeah. Professor Rao, you had spoken of a double burden sort of a situation having an impact on women, and this is in tandem with your article on the conversation. in which you are talking about how women form an integral part of the agricultural sector across South Asia, right? And they are often compelled to work for low or no wages and in poor conditions to meet their family's basic needs. So during the peak times of planting and harvesting seasons, these women are at the forefront of being vulnerable because their time becomes ill managed, right? And this sort of leaves them with like little time for domestic and care work, and leading thereafter to inadequate childcare and poor health. So, and this article that you had written, it was back in, I think, March. And over the past 3 months, how do you think this has panned out ever since the corona-induced lockdown has been initiated?
Yeah, I think so. I think following on from what Giti was saying, I think many in India, as you know, is a very unequal society. So we have lots of social divisions, whether it is caste, whether it is class, whether it is ethnicity, whether it is gender. And so we do need a differentiated analysis. And my work, of course, has been mostly with rural women and mostly drawing on the work of agricultural work of rural, mainly Adivasi or scheduled tribe women. So I think I would like to start that the social identity really matters in an Indian context, because even though we may have sort of universal rights framework or a legal framework, but actually who you are really shapes your social relationships and the way your entitlements you're able to practice uh, or not practice.
Yeah.
So I think this is something that's important. Now, in and the second thing I wanted to say is I think it has probably intensified some of the things that Geeti was saying. So if you look at a traditional gender division of labor, so the woman of the house, you know, is responsible for the care work, is also responsible for production, like in rural societies, but is also responsible for the domestic work, for care work, for cooking, for feeding the children, and so on. In fact, whether it's in rural, whether it's in urban, I think the burden of domestic work or domestic work is largely feminized, or it's seen as part of women's roles. Even if men may do it, they can do it as a hobby if they like, but it's women's responsibility within a kind of gender division of labor, in by and large, in a lot of societies. So what has happened now, I think, and that I talk about in the conversation piece, that first of all, maybe the workload hasn't increased because women, whether it's in urban areas particularly, I think I was referring to the conversation piece, that they are mainly in casual, informal work. And these were the first jobs to go. So all informal work shut down, whether it is street vendors, whether it is small shops, whatever. So, except for domestic workers and live-in domestic workers, but basically even the domestic workers who come and go, most middle-class employers ask the domestic workers not to come. A few might have paid them for not coming, but a majority didn't pay them. So women lost livelihoods, first of all, because they're in informal work. But they still have the responsibility of cooking and feeding and procuring and feeding their children. So how are they going to do it? I think in rural areas, what we're hearing is that they may have had, especially those who have some land, not the landless labor. I think they struggled and depended completely on PDS. But those who had some land, they might have had some stocks from the harvest of paddy in January or so, which is now finishing. So their food stock, if for the very marginal holders with whom I worked in Jharkhand, for instance, or in Odisha, their food stock, they harvest in January, it lasts till about May. And after that, basically, they have nothing. So, but at the same time, you know, that just having that paddy or dhan is not enough. You need other things. And this is where the migrant worker remittances come into play. And with no income, so you have zero income or cash coming in, but at the same time, you have to cook a meal. And so this has led to emotional stress, huge amount of stress on women. It has led to rise in indebtedness. I think we are hearing stories of from Bihar, wherever you look at, that most people are, you know, the government has not really played a role in terms of consumption loans. Now they are saying about PM Kisan for agriculture and so on. All the, but how will people live? They have to consume. And I think this has really driven people into loans. Women have been at the forefront of managing these social relations with money lenders. We hear of people, you know, moving from Delhi back to Bihar or Jharkhand, but how to pay for their ticket of 3,000 rupees, 4,000 rupees. Women have been borrowing at huge rates of interest, 10 rupees per month, 120 rupees per year, or if they're very, good money lender, maybe 4% per month. Even then, it's like 48% per year in order to pay for this. So I think this has happened. And how do they then repay? And I think I just want to link to something that Giti said, which is not only about sex workers or Dalits, but even other rural women have to get into risky employment in order to repay these loans, in order to feed their children. So it's even women from farming families who are having to go for part-time sex work in order to earn money in a crisis context. Child marriage. I was reading of reports that, daughters, they are not able to feed, and therefore they're marrying off 12-year, 15-year-old girls, to much older men, just for the sake, not that they don't like their daughters or love their daughters, but this is a coping strategy.
Exactly.
So a lot of risky behavior, a lot of negative, hard decisions which women are having to take because of this.
Yeah. Ma'am, also I was reading this Oxfam report.
It's the violence, and final point I wanted to say, which I've talked about in my paper, is linked to violence and violence against women. So I think if you look, again, this is a trend. If you look at the National Family Health demographic health data in India, they have questions on violence. And one of the reasons violence is high, one of the reasons that is justified for domestic violence is food. Actually, not having food or not cooking food properly and so on is seen by women as a reason, justifiable reason for violence against them. And of course, now with this crisis of food, and we have the rural survey compiled by Azim Premji University, done by various NGOs and others, that food consumption has declined across the board by at least 50%. So there's not enough food going around. And I think this is likely to have also normalized and increase in violence because women are not able to place food on the table.
Yeah. Ma'am, also on that note, there's this growing culture of work from home, right? And I've been reading a lot of reports where there's an increase in the gender-based violence that women are facing. And this is not only in the, in the so-called rich, the much more privileged, or the higher ends of the social ladder, but also the lower strata, where women's unpaid work leads to a higher sense of gender-based violence in India. So, and this has various ambits in it. So if you disobey the man in the family, there's harsh criticism, or there's beating up of women. You spend too much money without asking, you fail to take care of children, you leave a dependent or an adult unattended, all of this. And most importantly, and I see this report which says 86% of the women, they face harsh criticism when they leave the house without a permission. And all of these, sorts of gender-based violences, you think that would be on a rise in terms of how, women are now being, situated, like closely confined inside the houses?
Yeah. So just one point I wanted to make here, which is, from an theoretical understanding of gender-based violence, I think it is basically resulting from an unequal power relation, unequal gender relation. And one of the key factors which Giti mentioned also is masculinity or masculinization of all institutions. So one very important role of men, which gives them a sense of identity, which gives them a sense of dignity, is actually being able to play a provider role. So to provide for the family, this gives a sense of self, a sense of identity to men. And of course, that has been shattered now, especially for the casual working class, maybe not for the middle class with jobs, but even in the middle class, those who are in informal employment or, self-employed as we call, like travel industry, travel business, tourist guides, all that work has come to a standstill. So apart from the poor, I think even the lower middle class is in trouble. But, so this whole group who are basically, and that is 94% of India is really in what we call as the informal sector or self-employed sector, who have not had any income. And this has led to a very serious intensification of what we call as the crisis of masculinity. That men are kind of lost. I'm not being sympathetic, but we need to understand theoretically that, where is this violence coming from? And when men feel that they're useless, they don't have dignity, they're not able to play their provider roles, you have to take out your frustrations somewhere. And unfortunately, the wife or somebody at home, the women members of the home become the target. And this goes across institutions, because I think all institutions expect that men to be the powerful, men to be in control positions. And actually now with this pandemic, men have lost that control. They're not able to manage. And I think this has really created a crisis for men. And unfortunately, women are at the receiving end in terms of, different forms of domestic and other violences, including, not having food. I think I would say that, the thing about women eating last, eating least, but if you have lesser food, then the woman is again the one who's more
Exactly.
so going to sacrifice and therefore deprive herself. So all violence is not only physical violence, but there are other kinds of violences which have intensified, including self-deprivation, as for example, in the case of food.
Yeah.
And
Ma'am,
I
so,
know of
yeah.
instances of women actually in a city like Chennai, where I am now, who may have worked as domestic workers or so on for middle class households. They're actually desperate to get out of their home.
Yeah.
And they say that they need to earn. And, now with the risk rising, but actually the loss of livelihoods has been so shattering in all ways, as you said, economically, socially, that people really are now keen to, somehow or the other move out of home. This work at home really doesn't work in a context of where livelihoods are based on informal employment, in cities and in rural areas and so on.
Yeah. Ma'am, so like what has the state done so as far to like, protect the interests of the women who are now, subjugated to work from their homes, where the risk of, being treated to meted out, the risk of being meted out, more violence has increased. What has the state done to protect them as of now?
I think, I don't know, pretty little, I think. I think they have been in the first tranche of relief work. I think the state, one thing that they said is that they're going to transfer to women through their Jandhan accounts, 500 rupees.
Yeah.
And I think this, in a way, a recognition that they needed to put some money in the hands of women in order to some extent strengthen their, economic power or bargaining power or
Yeah.
whatever it is. Unfortunately, as you know, I think I'm not scoffing at it. Something is better than nothing. But in today's context, 500 rupees is really nothing. I think most assessments say that even if you want to, apart from the PDS, whatever you're getting, if you want to cook a meal, if you want to have some nutritious food on the table, women will need, at least if you want an LPG cylinder, that itself costs 500-600 rupees. You need spices, oil, lots of other things. And in today's time, you need minimum of 5, 6, 7,000 rupees in order to just manage your home at the very least
Yeah.
for a month. So putting these 500 rupees is a gesture that it's coming into women's names, into women's accounts, and so on. But it also, I think there are issues of exclusion, that it excludes all of the social protection, like Giti said, not only the LGBTQ, but it also excludes a lot of the very poor Dalit Adivasi women from these accounts. So there are real errors in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And secondly, it's very inadequate for women to perform their domestic roles or their reproductive roles or care roles or however we want to call it. And I think this really raises for me an issue which many people have said about citizenship, and how do we construct citizenship, and how do we understand citizenship and rights, how do we understand justice, and how are these double standards. I always think that for a person like us, from a middle class, 500 rupees is not even enough.
Yeah.
Run monthly provisions. If I buy at the very minimum, it even then costs me 7 to 10,000 rupees, plus another 1,000 rupees a month for a week for vegetables or whatever it is. How can we, in today's time of inflation, have these double standards of saying that let these people manage with 500 rupees? We're clearly constructing citizenship very differently, and that whole inequality in terms of I am a different kind of citizen from an Adivasi woman in Dumka or Jharkhand or Koraput in Odisha or wherever. And of course, as Geeti said, it's worse also for LGBTQ who are totally socially excluded from this. So I think we really need, this COVID has thrown up that, that we really need to rethink, where are citizenship rights coming from? We say they are universal. In a few cases, like the right to work, again, Manrega. But Manrega, I think there's been a lot of debate about it. It's really about manual, unskilled work. A lot of the migrant workers coming back, they actually see themselves as skilled, and they don't want to go for Manrega. Even 10 years ago, when I was talking to educated youth like yourself, Sahil, in Jharkhand, and asked them, they had bothered to study, they had invested in their education, and they told me that, Didi, we want jobs. We don't want to work in farming. Neither do we want to work in Manrega, because it is just digging work, mud work, earth work. And we want to do something better. And now we are pushing back these same boys and girls who came to the cities to work, to find dignity, to find dignified work. We are telling them that you go back and go to Manrega. What kind of justice or what kind of citizenship is this? We would never go even one day into that kind of work, but we are expecting them. They also feel they have invested, they have done graduation, and now we are telling them, okay, go back to your villages and do Manrega. So I think there are huge issues in terms of addressing some of these inequities. We have failed very badly. I feel that we have really failed very badly. And India, 70 years or whatever of more than 70 years, 75 years of independence, and really we have not created universal rights. I mean, legally we have, like National Food Security Act is a universal right, which goes to the right to food, which really is defined by the United Nations as, adequate, safe, nutritious food to everyone at all times, as per their preferences. And now if you see, food packets, I mean, I really appreciate NGOs, but still food packets being given to these workers, is not really a right to food as it is defined in the United Nations. It may fill their stomach, but it's very different from a right to adequate, safe, nutritious food at all times for all people. And we also know that a lot of people are skipping food, for instance. The rural survey shows, the rural assessments, which are quick assessments, which have been done, that people are skipping meals. So I'm afraid that actually, whether it is apathy of the state or apathy of all of us, but we have not created, equal citizenship for all citizens of this country. And this COVID has really exposed the fault lines in terms of social inequality, gender inequality, caste inequality within our society.
Professor, and this is to Professor Geeti Das, on the notion of NGOs and civil societies, you see how the state has done nothing or very little for the transgender community. So I was reading this report in which a group of over 2,000 transgender activists have appealed to the Home, Finance, and the Social Justice and Empowerment Ministries for help. And they were pointing out that less than only 1% of them have received a sum of rupees 1,500 from the National Institute of Social Defense, NISD, which is under the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. So, here the only support was offered through the NISD, which asked them to apply for monetary aid through online servers or whatever. And yet there was this sense of, information asymmetry amongst the transgender community in terms of, what is happening and how is the state providing for them. So here you see that where the state has left a vacuum in the sense of helping these communities, the NGOs and civil societies have played a major role. So do you think that's the way forward, or does the state need to really step up over here?
So just to be clear, I don't know where you're getting the information that NGOs have played a major role, because I think a lot of the time what you see, especially with trans communities in India, is they are organizing themselves. And there's a big difference between an external NGO organized by somebody else that goes and works with the community, and there are those, and self-organized communities which may or may not form NGOs. And I think right now their lines of survival predominantly are themselves and their own self-organizing, and organizations, and there are some NGOs that are involved. But there are two things about the NGO approach. One is you have to work in partnership if you are going to go through the NGO process. It can't be this kind of top-down intervention. But the other is that I think, when we, especially I notice in sort of elite or academic spaces in India, we have a tendency to equate civil society with NGOs. But often NGOs are also complicit in kind of shutting down the type of organizing that people are already engaged in, because there's a tendency to go and say, well, this has to look like this, right? So NGOs have to be very sensitive if they're coming from this kind of external position to how are you affecting the power dynamics? How are you dealing with their self-understandings? Are you approaching people with respect? Right? What I have been seeing for the last, since the pandemic broke out, is, yes, there's some involvement of NGOs, but by and large, it's actually, there's a lot of fundraising, there's a lot of self-organizing. And the one thing to remember, especially with trans communities, which I was also thinking about when we were talking about domestic violence, I just want to go back on that, go back to that for a moment as well, which is that, you know, I like Dr. Rao, I really like what you said about domestic violence, expanding the notion of domestic violence also to think about these structural issues. One thing I've been thinking about is the violence enacted against domestic workers, especially live-in domestic work, which is not typically part of our understanding of domestic violence because it focuses on the household as the family. But we have to think about sort of household work, which is always kind of kept low in that hierarchy. But for trans people in urban areas who are not coming from richer backgrounds and who don't have the capital to kind of set up their own residential arrangements, they are discriminated against in terms of getting housing. They are overwhelmingly renting their land. They deal with routine discrimination from their landlords, and their sources of livelihood include, informal labor predominantly, and sex work and begging, all of which are being shut down right now. And we have been actively involved in their own fundraising. So I think, when we talk about civil society in this kind of space, I think it's also important to keep in mind that they have already been socially isolated. So if anything, if we're going to talk about civil society lessons about social isolation, then we should maybe be thinking about how to learn lessons rather than going in with this idea that there's a particular type of NGO organizing that will go in and solve problems with a particular type of expertise.
Okay. Professor, on that note also, another ambit in which the transgender community has faced an immense amount of discrimination has been their access to basic healthcare. And it only gets worsened during the time of a pandemic, right? So, already they are seen as on the fringes of the society. And then when many patients are competing for limited healthcare resources, then naturally one of the groups that get the least priority, which is in this case the transgender community, in terms of access and availability of healthcare facilities, they get shunted to the back of the line, right? So has that panned out really poorly in terms of how the state has handled this crisis?
Based on what people are saying about their experiences, yes, absolutely. But I think this also points to another problem. And I was looking at the World Health Organization's latest memo, as far as I can tell, on gender, their advocacy brief on gender and COVID-19, where one of the things that they point out is most member states are not even collecting data on men and women. They're not even collecting data based on binary gender. Trans people are routinely left out of healthcare data, except where transgender as a category is treated as a mental disorder, right? Or as a psychiatric problem. Then you get this kind of data collection. Otherwise, a lot of the time it's completely left out, even of the mental health frameworks. And in terms of, other kinds of healthcare work, there's no, this information is not being collected. So, the only people who are positioned to kind of assess and speak to this are the people experiencing it. But I think it also points to a big gap in the way that healthcare service provision is understood. And I do think that a little bit more sort of formal inclusion in that sense would have some potential to at least normalize the idea that, look, people are entitled to healthcare, and kind of discrimination can't be allowed to pass as normal medical practice. But in terms of the scale, I think there's just a basic measurement issue, which is the invisibilization of transgender to begin with.
Okay. Now, on the spatial nature of human mobility in both urban and rural spaces, now when groups across social aggregates of class, caste, race, ethnicity, and gender, when they find themselves difficult to navigate, and Professor Geeti, that's probably you could start off with this question. How can we study the impact of a crisis of mobility for gendered communities, which extends to both women and the LGBTQ community?
So, I will say this: I identify as queer, and genderqueer, and I have no crisis. I have no crisis of mobility that is not sort of being faced by everybody under lockdown, right? I have the least possible crisis of mobility. So I think also we need to always disaggregate this along other hierarchies. But I think one thing is sort of, if we say, how do you study the impact of a crisis of mobility? there's a few things I want, or how can one study it? I want to raise a few questions. One is, who is doing the studying and of whom? What is the purpose of that study? Because I think even the methods of study are always normative. So what kinds of norms is one going in with in order to do a kind of study like this? Which communities, right? If we talk about women in LGBTQ, again, there's this sort of problem where usually the voices that come to any kind of table that are set up, there is always kind of affected by power and privilege. But I think that said, in terms of the gendered impacts of crisis, there are two things within urban politics that come up repeatedly. One, which also speaks to, I think, what Dr. Rao was saying about rural women, right, is labor and livelihood and informality. Urban informality has been treated as a problem. And Ananya Roy has written a lot about this, about how state solutions and also all of these new actors who are getting into the urban politics game, right? Like now it's not just about the state anymore, and it's not about human habitat anymore. Actually, the most powerful players are multinationals, right? KPMG is getting in on this. McKinsey is shaping urban policy. Now, there's a tendency to kind of have portable solutions where the first world city, certain first world cities are held up as like this ideal global city. And cities in poorer countries are held up as mega cities, right? As problems, as sort of burdening, as out of control. And there you see several kind of gendered ways in which this plays out. One is the overrepresentation of women and of trans women in informal labor, right, and in poverty. The other is that even this kind of division between global cities and mega cities also appeals to the language of population control, which is also about sort of the gender relation structuring society. But I think in terms of mobility, see, one of the big issues of where urban mobility is dealt with is in transport planning. And transport planning is an extremely male-dominated field, and there's been a lot of critique of the fact that it doesn't even deal with differential gender patterns in how people use public transport. So if you have a very sort of map's eye planning-oriented view that looks at a grid and looks at street systems and says, okay, I have to connect point A to point B, and then point B, which is the end point of connection, will then service all of the all of the surrounding areas, right? You're sort of creating an imaginary circuit that may or may not exist in practice. So from that end point of transportation planning, it doesn't deal with the circuits of travel from home to public transport. It doesn't deal with questions of public safety, of lighting, of the neighborhood norms around how people can move and how freely they can move and how that can be dealt with. So even in non-crisis times, urban mobility is structured in an extremely gendered way. Delhi has done a lot to kind of deal with this, especially but the problem is that you end up with what are called pink solutions, right? Like the women's only car, which still don't deal with the fact that if you look at the patterns of movement and you look at the patterns of informality, there's just a whole lot that is being left out. So in that sense, I think this is it's not so much just the current crisis of mobility under lockdown, under social distancing, under physical distancing, and also under the securitization of physical distancing, right? That in country after country, whether it's developed or developing or whatever you want to call it, you see vulnerable groups being targeted by policing for violating social distancing, and you see differential patterns of targeting, right? Which we're seeing in the US right now, or in France, they've been arresting homeless people for violating social distancing orders, and where they're supposed to go, I don't know. But the question also is sort of this crisis of, so right now, yes, we're all under lockdown, but in terms of thinking about what kinds of permits are issued and what the transport solutions are, I'm afraid that we will continue to see the same kind of policy and planning initiatives that center the experiences of men in formal work. And to the extent that they deal with informality, they deal with male informal labor. Or male-dominated informal labor, like construction.
Dr. Rao, your interjections on the same.
Well, I think it's more or less, I don't have anything very much more to say on this. I think I already seen some of this, that in terms of mobility, we need to look, from a disaggregated perspective. I think as a person working with gender and gender analysis, that is something we tend to do. We don't homogenize, but we try to look at sort of what I spoke about before in terms of intersecting identities, that it's not really a man or a woman, but it could be a young man and an old man, or a young woman and an old woman, and of course, or a Dalit or an Adivasi or whatever. So I think mobility patterns, of course, are always different.
Yeah.
And they are very much linked to the roles, to, sort of the labor, gender divisions of labor, to the roles, but also to the norms, to the social expectations of who's expected to go into the public space, who's expected to stay at home. So I think there is the whole normative framing of gender relations, which also shapes mobility patterns. So I think mobility is not something different. I think mobility comes out of this. And I think, as Giti rightly said, under the lockdown, I think the problems have arisen because people who are expected to be mobile are not mobile either. So everybody is sitting at home. And we spoke earlier about violence and so on. And I think some of these come because of the disruptions across the board, and the immobility or the lack of mobility in all its meanings. So not just physical mobility, of course, economic and economic aspirations, no money, no incomes, which we spoke about. Social norms of, men find it very difficult also to be sitting at home, not interacting, with their friends, or not going to the tea shops and so on. And also, you must understand that for a lot of people, they don't have the luxury of a big home. It's often a one-room tenement or a one-room hut. And I think this whole thing of being stuck, of being immobile, is also a problem. It's also a problem for a lot of people, for the economically, socially, physically, in every possible way. So I think that we really need to understand, we really need to disaggregate, where are we looking at, who are we looking at, what are the methods we are going to look at. Because of course, these are also, at the bottom line for me, that these are also issues of human dignity. When we are also researching as researchers, I sometimes feel very bad when on TV they ask, that somebody has died and aapko kaisa lag raha hai? How are you feeling? No, that's a very wrong question to ask. It's a very insensitive question to ask. So I think as researchers, at a time when people have lost dignity, when they have been thrown out of what they had said, they're going back to villages. They were the hope for the families in the village, and they're going back. And then to be asking questions, okay, how are you feeling? Or what are you doing? This is adding insult to injury. So I think we have to be very sensitive in terms of researching what is this. In the UK, where I work, where I teach, I think a big issue is really about the ethics of research. And, how do you, when people are in crisis, how do you approach them? What do you talk about them? Talk to them about, I have several research projects in India at the moment, and they're really rethinking that even once the lockdown is lifted, or once things get back, maybe in a couple of months, how do we approach these communities which have been badly shattered? It can't be business as usual. We can't do research as usual. We have to think about how we are going to approach, how we are going to facilitate. So with one of my research projects, I just wanted to make that as the last kind of remark on research, is really that, it was a research impact project. We were talking about food systems and sustainable food systems, and we were actually setting up an app, and a mobile-based app, to set up sort of co-creation of knowledge with communities in Odisha, Jharkhand, Bihar, and so on. We were just about to launch it. We had done the preparatory work in the beginning of April. Just before that, the lockdown happened. We couldn't, but I think basic infrastructures we had in place. And we had just managed to, initially distribute a sort of leaflet with the number and so on. And you won't believe, so many people are calling up, basically from those communities who had that leaflet, saying, please help us. We are not having food. We need to get back home, from Surat, from Bombay, from different places. And actually, this was a research project, but we've totally had to take a decision to divert from the content that we were planning to work on food system, to actually just move into grievance redressal. So I think that, as researchers, one has to be sensitive to what this has done, or what any crisis, and this crisis in particular, has done to people's lives, both men and women, of different social categories. In fact, some of the middle class, as I said, OBCs, maybe their masculinity is hit more because they see themselves as being better off and not being begging. So they feel that it's okay, Dalits can sort of ask for food packets, but we are the better off in the village, and we can't be seen to be asking for food packets. And actually, in some ways, they're more bruised by this whole kind of stigma and this whole loss of dignity that they have had to encounter. So I think really, when you think about mobility, we have to also think about immobility and what it does to different people, and how do we really, as researchers, approach it, keeping in mind, basic human dignity. I think for me, that's the bottom line.
Yeah. Ma'am, also for a long span of time, these workers have been seen as invincible, right? But we need to understand here that the migration of single women for work has been on the rise with the middle classization, if I may call it, of the Indian cities. So this middle classization, as one might call it, which is an outcome of the growth of the service sector, has spurred a series of consequences. It has created jobs for both men and women. And a large number of nuclear families with both spouses working in professional spaces, like such as my parents, both of them work, it has led to a creation of a set of service demands within the family. So now this is now being met primarily by those at the bottom ladder of the social, by the bottom of the social ladder, right? So as the educated middle class women join the workforce, domestic work, including taking care of the children and the elderly, which is conventionally, and if some might call it conveniently, as seen as women's work, it has been outsourced to women from an economically poorer section. So on this note, it becomes very important for these women who are part of the domestic help, for them to come back into the workspace, so that the women who are who the educated middle class women can join back their workspace, right? So it's a system which is interlinked. So how fast do you think the sense of reverse migration is going to happen, considering how this whole situation has panned out?
So I think you're quite right. And I think in the literature, this has been called the global care chains.
Okay.
It's not only about India, but I think in the US, most of, now the work participation of women is high. It's about 60 to 70%. And I think a lot of them, they import domestic workers, or the reproductive labor, if we call it that, from other countries. So Philippines, Vietnam, other sort of poorer countries, the women actually go and start working as domestic workers, and so on. So I think from Kerala itself, we have people going to Italy or to other countries, or Gulf. So I think that this is a global chain, that where the better off, it's not only an Indian phenomenon, but where the better off countries are importing reproductive labor from the poorer countries. Within poorer countries, as you rightly pointed out, the better off people are importing the labor of poorer people, whether from the towns or from the rural areas, and so on. So I think, there's a lot of work on domestic work, and I don't want, we don't really have that much time to go into this on domestic workers, but of course, this is itself a very diverse category. So you have the live-in domestic workers, who are really the single women, I think, migrating particularly from tribal areas of India, who come to the metros and who live in homes. And this is also the construction of a particular identity of tribal women as somehow being simple, they won't cheat, they are innocent, they are reliable. So you kind of also infantilize, or in a way create a tribal identity as something very simple-minded, foolish, they're not smart enough to cheat, they won't do anything, and so on. And anyway, so that's a different issue, but they are the live-in workers. I think actually a lot of live-in workers have remained, have stayed in the homes where they are working. They have not been sent back because they were already there. So they are part of that household, if you like. I think the problem in the domestic work sector has really come with the part-time workers who work in 4 or 5 homes, and they may be. So from a dignity point of view, I've done some work on domestic workers from Jharkhand. Actually, these girls also, once they've stayed in Delhi for 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years as a live-in, they actually like, or they aspire, that is their aspiration, to live outside. So 2 or 3 girls may join together and take a place on rent, and then go during the day and work, because they also want to have some own space rather than being on 24/7 call. So I think it is the girls who have moved out, or the other set of domestic workers is really rural to urban migrants who have come as families. And they then, the women do domestic work as part-time workers, and the men do other kinds of domestic work. So they may do gardening, they may do car cleaning, they may do driving. So that's also domestic labor. But they are doing different kinds of domestic labor, and the women are doing different kinds of labor. These kinds of households often have also children, because it's a family-based migration.
Yeah.
And I think they have been really bad. So not all of them. I mean, many of them live in slums like in Delhi or other metros. So many of them, I'm not sure of the figures again. I don't know whether they have gone back to their villages or they have stayed on in the city. I know that in Delhi, a lot of them have stayed on in the city and they are looking to come back to work. But many of the middle class employers don't yet want them back because many resident welfare associations and so on have rules where they have barred the domestic workers from coming in. So many of these women or men are not allowed to come back into the house, but they have not really gone back. They are desperate to go back to work, basically because they don't have money and they don't have food and they really need to feed their families and feed their children. Some employers have given them money, as I said, salaries. Many employers have not given them their salaries. So I think the problem is a little bit different. And again, we need to understand it in a more nuanced way. I think it is more the agricultural labor, the factory labor, and small enterprises which shut down. I think those are the kinds of people who've actually moved back to the villages, not so much the domestic workers.
Okay.
But I don't know till I see some research on this.
Yeah. Okay. Now, looking at the historical context of past social and economic crises that have disproportionately impacted gendered groups, and based on a comparative mapping from similar scenarios of other nations, how can communities advocate and institutionalize for a rights-based framework to development for all gender groups, which in turn would ensure equality of opportunity and distributive justice for social welfare? Professor Geeti Das, if you could please.
Okay, I will be very brief with this because I already spoke about the transgender bill in India.
Yeah.
But I think I think we should take that as a cautionary tale in asking this type of question. And this also comes up, I mean, Dr. Rao, you've worked on this in talking about land entitlements, in writing about gender and land entitlements, which is, does institutionalizing a rights-based, does the institutionalization of rights necessarily always help, or are there times when it actually throws up new barriers? And so one of the things coming up with the Transgender Bill of Rights, for example, is the emphasis on formal rights is also an excuse to create new bureaucracy, right? Or to intensify existing bureaucracy. So it could, the same thing that sort of on paper is claiming to help a community can in practice actually be reproducing or sort of reshaping their marginalization in new ways. The other thing to keep in mind is also sort of, if depending on which communities we're talking about, with the Trans Bill of Rights, this is actually the dilution or the sidestepping of demands and needs that have already been clearly articulated by communities who have been speaking for themselves. So there is no shortage of advocacy. Okay. The problem is that the legal response to that advocacy and the state response to that advocacy has been to try to diffuse or neutralize the scale of community organizing and mobilization by kind of diluting the response, and then it gets channeled through further institutions. So you know there was already critique of the Supreme Court judgment, but then the way that the state bureaucracy has taken this up has actually had very, very transphobic consequences. So
ma'am, so wait, is this because of the patriarchal nature of the state that they've turned a blind eye towards the needs of such people?
Well, I mean, yes, but I think also when we say patriarchal, I mean, I would say the gendered nature of the state, maybe, because I think also there's a tendency in theories of patriarchy to emphasize cisgender relations.
Okay.
Whereas, you know, if we're talking about trans politics, then yeah, the state has all, I mean, and this is not specific to India, right? This is worldwide, that even as third gender groups or so-called third gender groups are somewhat included in some states, the mechanism of inclusion is sort of controlled and contained in such a way that it produces new kinds of sidelining. And even for the people who are being explicitly included, it subjects them to policing from state agents who are not necessarily sympathetic at all.
Okay.
So I think that there's also a tendency to think of sort of portable solutions, which I think we really have to step beyond. You know, so as Dr. Rao was saying, like, you work with context, you work with people. But one thing that I would say is that is, if we can derive any kind of universal lesson, is that any solution that sort of says, okay, the solution is in the form of a deliverable, right? That it happens in one moment, that maybe there is some sort of community articulation or advocacy in one period of time,
yeah,
and then it's resolved,
yeah,
and that's that, is always going to produce these kinds of vulnerabilities. And so I think we have to think about how to have a politics of more continuous voice and negotiation rather than a kind of endpoint deliverable solution that happens in one go. And also to kind of look at what are the existing community mobilizations and forms of advocacy, and how are they then interacting with the rights-based framework? Does the institutionalization and implementation of rights work with those structures, or does it seek to neutralize it?
yeah. Dr. Rao, your takes on this?
I think I agree more or less with what Geeti has just said. I guess, within sort of gender analysis, the whole move or demands for gender equality globally, again,
Mm-hmm.
is that why the rights-based framework really came in was that you need some kind of an enabling environment. So we're talking about structural inequality. And if people have to actually gain justice or struggle for justice, then you need some kind of standards or some kind of an enabling environment. And I think that's why the feminist movement did push a lot for legal reform.
Yeah,
Now, having said that, I think in India, actually, we have a reasonable set of laws. You know, I'm not taking the specific case of the transgender, but we have, in terms of gender equality, broadly understood as male and female. You have, of course, equal opportunities, but we also have things like the inheritance, the reform to the Hindu Succession Act of 2005. You have within Nariga that there should be equal wages for men and women. So to some extent, there is of course, the violence laws, the criminal procedure code amendment of 2013 after the Justice Verma Commission. So you have a reasonable legal framework. And I think the problem is the next step. And I think this is what now a lot of people are saying, that we need a legal framework. We need to advocate for a legal framework, but that's not the end point, because having a legal framework doesn't solve
yeah,
the problem of social structure and social inequality and hierarchies of power at different levels. So here one needs really that how do we then put it into practice? So we have a law, but how does the then law get translated into practice? And I think that is where we have failed. So if you look at the Domestic Violence Act or the domestic violence laws or the amendment to the Criminal Procedure Act and so on, that there was part of the recommendation, including from the Justice Verma Commission, that you need training for the for the police, you need judiciary training, you need a change actually in textbooks and in educational systems more
yeah,
broadly. You need change in how media or films project gender relations and women. And I'm happy to say that there are a few people now who are producing quite good gender-oriented Bollywood cinema, for instance,
yeah,
recently, past gender, and so on, like Pink and others, and different languages. So I think that this whole structural transformation, how do you change people's mindsets? How do you change people's attitudes? This needs law, but it needs more than law. And I think that is where we have not really, we give very mixed signals. So, you say curricular reform, but you'll still show, the father is taking a briefcase and
yeah,
going out and the mother is sitting at home. Or, Adivasis or tribals are shown in such poor light. They're always shown as labor. They're never shown in a white collar job or anything. So when I've been in Jharkhand working with children in schools, actually they get such a repugnance or they get such a negative sense of their own self,
yeah,
because this is the portrayal. So I think we need law, our fundamental rights of the Indian Constitution give equality to everybody.
yeah,
And we have a whole sets of laws, including on gender. But how are we actually how are we transforming it within society? How are we taking it to society? Sexual harassment, okay, at the workplace, but why posters, films, in all realms of life, we have to bring change. If we really want to bring a change in attitudes, change in treatment, change in, there have been jokes now going on during this COVID-19 with a lot of middle class men posting, how they have cooked certain things and posting it on WhatsApp groups and so on. But it's
yeah,
a hobby. I mean, they don't have to do it. They don't
exactly,
feel
yeah,
they have to share on a day-to-day basis this job. So this is, I think that is the change that has to come. That it's not a hobby. We have to change our attitudes on a more permanent basis. So I think that's where, and in a way, I think I've seen some newspaper editorials that for the first time, because celebrities, Bollywood stars are doing jhadu, pocha, and so on, then washing vessels. Suddenly, everybody is saying that no, domestic work is very important. It has been visible. We must recognize women's work. So I'm hoping that as a result of the pandemic, one positive outcome might be that a lot of the invisible care work that women perform is maybe now, I hope, will on a more permanent basis become more visible and therefore more valued, and that women's work, domestic work, which is so much taken for granted. We started with this. I think that's probably my concluding remark, that I started with the double burden of work, but I hope as a result of COVID pandemic, with a lot of loss and a lot of hardship, I hope that on the gender side, one of the positive outcomes is going to be that women's unpaid, everyday domestic labor will get visibility, will get recognition, and will get value.
Okay, that's a very optimistic view from Dr. Rao as she concludes. Professor Geeti Das, your last comments on the same?
I don't have much to add. I completely agree with Dr. Rao's analysis. I think that, so exactly, I mean, the rights-based framework is sort of the first step, right? And this is what communities have been advocating for, and there's been a lot of debate among them as well, right? So I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of what the problem is, it's not necessarily the enshrining of legal rights itself that shouldn't happen, but that how it's done and how it's and what is used to implement it afterwards becomes a problem. But I think I don't really have a lot to add, but just by way of conclusion, I would also say that I hope that this moment will also bring a little bit more visibility to issues of caste and transgender when talking about gender politics, because I think the way that these communities have been left out and are still being left out, especially of government schemes, I mean, that is something that even from home, we can surely, at least anybody with any kind of power and access can be advocating for.
Yeah. So I guess we've run out of time. On behalf of the entire Politica team, I'd like to extend my gratitude to both of you for investing your time and your energy in this virtual panel discussion. Thank you so much.